You thought it was love, but it was loneliness with a pretty name. You craved his voice and got silence as a reward. You weren't growing. You were shrinking to fit his comfort. You kept showing up, hoping he'd finally notice. Silence became your lullaby. Pain became your routine. You weren't held. You were haunted. This wasn't love. It was emotional survival. And now, you're waking up. You weren't being loved. You were being emotionally abandoned in slow motion. And that's the hardest kind of heartbreak to recognize, because it doesn't come with yelling or slamming doors. It doesn't leave bruises on your skin. It leaves them in places no one else can see. He didn't walk away, he stayed. But his silence was louder than any goodbye you've ever heard. And you mistook his presence for love, when really all he did was occupy space and drain the life out of it. You convinced yourself it was just a quiet season, that he was processing, that maybe he just doesn't know how to express himself. You gave him every benefit of the doubt, every inch of your empathy, and still his silence swallowed every effort you made. You were loving a ghost with a heartbeat, someone physically present, but emotionally unreachable. You poured your words into the void, hoping they'd echo back as connection, and instead, all you got was emptiness. You called it loyalty. You called it growth. But it was survival. You sat across from him at the dinner table and felt more alone than when you were truly by yourself. You reached out, emotionally starving, and received cold nods and half-hearted replies. You were shrinking, bending, softening your truth just to avoid pushing him further away. But the truth is, he was already gone. Gone long before you ever admitted it to yourself. His silence wasn't passive, it was calculated. It made you question your worth, your voice, your sanity. You started to think you were too needy, too emotional, too sensitive. Maybe you were asking for too much. But love isn't measured in silence. It's measured in showing up, in being present, in choosing connection even when it's hard. And that's something he never did. He watched you ache. He saw you wither. And he stayed silent, not because he didn't notice, but because it was easier for him to watch you adapt to his absence than for him to show up fully. You became fluent in pretending, smiling when you were hurting, laughing when you were dying inside, posting pictures with filters and captions while your soul was breaking behind the scenes. You told your friends, it's just a phase, even though you knew deep down the phase never ends. It's the relationship itself that's hollow. You were performing love alone, carrying both sides of the emotional load until you didn't even recognize yourself anymore. You started to apologize for your needs. You stopped expressing your feelings, afraid they'd push him away more. You built your world around his silence, carefully tiptoeing, hoping your voice wouldn't be too loud, your tears wouldn't be too heavy. And when you finally cracked, when the silence became unbearable, he told you you're overreacting, as if your hunger for connection was something to be ashamed of, as if your pain was irrational, as if being loved loudly, fully, consistently was too much to ask. But it's not too much. It never was. You were never asking for too much. You were just asking the wrong person. You were trying to build a bridge with someone who only knew how to build walls. And in that process, you lost yourself, bit by bit, piece by piece. And the scariest part, you started to believe that maybe this is all love ever was, silent, cold, distant. But here's the truth. Silence, when weaponized, is emotional abandonment. It's the slowest form of leaving, the kind that doesn't announce itself. It just slips away one ignored feeling at a time. One missed opportunity for connection, one unanswered plea. And before you know it, you're in a relationship where you do all the talking, all the healing, all the trying, and he's just there, quiet, unmoved, unchanged. The saddest part, you loved him, genuinely. You loved him with a softness that deserved to be met, not muted. You gave your all to someone who only ever gave you pieces. And now you're standing in the aftermath, trying to figure out how you ever mistook this for love. Trying to forgive yourself for staying, for holding on, for waiting in the silence, hoping it would one day become music. But love doesn't sound like silence. Love sounds like, I see you. I hear you. You matter to me. And if you didn't hear those things, not once, not consistently, not clearly, then no, it wasn't love. It was emotional survival disguised as loyalty. And survival isn't the same as love. One keeps you breathing. The other makes you feel alive. You deserve love that speaks, that touches, that shows up without having to be begged. You deserve a love that isn't silent, a love that listens, a love that chooses you loudly. Always remember, you weren't being loved. You were being emotionally abandoned in slow motion. And now you're waking up. His silence wasn't mystery. It was manipulation masked as peace. And you didn't realize it at first, because it didn't look like anger. It didn't sound like yelling. It came dressed in quiet shrugs, blank stares, and carefully timed silences that made you question yourself more than him. You told yourself he's just calm, he needs space, or he's just not a talker. But deep down, you knew. You felt the weight of that silence. And it didn't feel like peace. It felt like punishment. He wasn't silent because he didn't know what to say. He was silent because he knew exactly what silence would do to you, how it would shake your confidence, make you second. Guess every word you said, every move you made. You started analyzing yourself more than you analyzed him. Did I upset him? Should I not have brought that up? Maybe I'm being too much again. And that's where the manipulation begins. Not in what he says, but in what he withholds. He weaponized stillness. He turned his silence into a mirror, forcing you to reflect on your flaws while he stood untouched in his own shadows. Every time you voiced a concern, expressed your pain, or asked for connection, he withdrew. Not loudly, not obviously, just enough to make you feel like the problem was you, like you were the emotional one, the overthinker, the unstable one. And then he'd return days later with the same cold calmness, pretending nothing happened. That was the cycle, your storm, his silence, your apology, his reset. Over and over. It wasn't mystery. It wasn't depth. It was avoidance dressed as wisdom. He wasn't deep. He was distant. He wasn't reflective. He was emotionally unavailable. And you mistook his quiet for maturity. But what's mature about disappearing emotionally when things get uncomfortable? What's deep about shutting down when someone needs you to show up? Real peace doesn't make you question your reality. Real peace doesn't make you anxious, wondering when the next emotional shutdown is coming. Real peace is communication, not control. But he used silence to dominate the space between you, to keep you off balance, always trying to fix something you didn't break. You were walking on eggshells while he sat in stone, faced calmness, and you called it healthy conflict resolution. But it wasn't resolution, it was rejection in disguise. You stopped expressing yourself. not because you ran out of feelings, but because you learned they didn't matter to him. You could cry, and he'd blink. You could pour your soul out, and he'd offer a one-word answer. You could beg for connection, and all you'd get was stillness. And when you finally got tired of begging and went quiet yourself, that's when he'd suddenly engage. Ask, "Why are you being distant?" As if he hadn't taught you how. That's the manipulation. He stayed silent until you matched his silence, and then made you feel like the cold one. His silence was never neutral. It was a power play, a way to hold control without ever raising his voice. He knew you needed answers. He knew you sought closure. He knew you had a heart that wanted to understand. And instead of offering clarity, he offered confusion. Knowing you'd stay stuck in it, searching for meaning where there was none, he fed off your overthinking. He knew that the more silent he became, the louder your thoughts would scream. And he let them, because it kept the attention off of him and squarely on you. You kept thinking he was just different, that maybe he hadn't been taught how to communicate, that he needed more time, more space, more love. But people who care try. People who love you meet you halfway. And silence. That's not how love speaks. That's how control survives. You gave him understanding, compassion, patience. All he gave you was confusion, and still you stayed, hoping one day the silence would turn to softness. But silence isn't always empty. Sometimes it's full of intent. His was. It was full of strategy, full of unspoken blame, full of carefully designed detachment that kept you chasing him. You wanted clarity. He wanted control. You wanted healing. He wanted distance. And you were never on the same page because he never let you hold the pen. Eventually, you started to disappear in that silence. You stopped asking questions, stopped seeking connection. You learned to keep your thoughts inside because letting them out only led to more silence. And that's the deepest kind of betrayal. When someone slowly teaches you that your voice doesn't matter, that your feelings are too much, that your truth is inconvenient. But here's what you need to remember: silence isn't always golden. Sometimes it's a prison. Sometimes it's the echo of a person who was never really there to begin with. And love speaks. Love listens. Love doesn't leave you wondering if you're hard to love. You were never too much. He was just too quiet to care, too silent to step up, too emotionally disconnected to build something real. That wasn't peace. That wasn't depth. That wasn't mystery. That was manipulation, and you don't live there anymore. You didn't fall in love. You fell into a void and called it home. That void didn't greet you with warmth or safety. It welcomed you with confusion, silence, and emotional distance. But because it resembled parts of your past, the wounds, the absence, the ache, you mistook it for familiarity. You mistook it for love. You convinced yourself that this emptiness could be filled if you just loved harder, tried more, stayed longer. But the truth is, you were never loved there. You were just slowly disappearing inside a space built for your silence, not your voice. He wasn't your home. He was your holding cell. And every time you felt that loneliness creep in, you called it passion. Every time he pulled away, you called it mystery. Every time you cried alone and said nothing, you called it strength. Because if you admitted what it really was, that you were alone in something that should have held you, then you'd have to face the reality that it was never love in the first place. But it wasn't love. Love doesn't feel like abandonment. It doesn't make you question your value or wonder why your needs are always too much. Real love wraps around you. It leans in. It holds space for your voice, your tears, your truth. What you had was the illusion of love built on hope and habit. And you built a home in that illusion, brick by brick, excuse by excuse, until even you forgot what real love was supposed to feel like. You thought the void was temporary, that he was just going through something. That with time, the silence would turn into softness, the distance into intimacy. You believed your patience would be the cure. That if you could just love him enough, he'd finally feel safe enough to open up. But the truth is, you were never inside a relationship. You were orbiting someone's emotional absence, waiting to be invited in. You fell into a void, and that void mirrored your deepest fears, being unseen, unheard, unchosen. And instead of running from it, you stayed, thinking this was what love sometimes looks like. But it wasn't love. It was emotional starvation wrapped in small moments of warmth that made you think the cold was worth enduring. He'd say just enough to keep you holding on, do just enough to make you stay, but never enough to make you feel truly loved. That was the pattern. That was the trap. You gave your best to a black hole. You kept offering more of yourself, hoping he'd meet you in the middle. But he never did. He took, and you gave until you were unrecognizable to yourself. You stopped asking for what you needed. You stopped expecting anything at all. And somehow you called that loyalty. But it was never loyalty. It was survival. A slow shrinking of yourself in order to avoid abandonment. You settled for moments when you deserved consistency. You clung to potential when you deserved presence. You built dreams in your mind while he stayed stuck in his own detachment. And you waited. Not because you didn't know your worth, but because you forgot it in the silence. His emotional distance made you question everything about yourself. Was I too emotional, too intense, too insecure? But you weren't the problem. You were just trying to build something real with someone who never brought real materials to the table. The worst part is, when you finally realized the void wouldn't change, you blamed yourself. You thought you failed the relationship. But how can you fail something you were never fully a part of? You weren't in a relationship. You were in a loop, a cycle of giving, hoping, hurting, and pretending. You fell into that void and made it your identity. You made it your home. But a home should feel safe, not suffocating. Now that you're looking back, the signs were always there. The constant waiting. The emotional unavailability. The conversations that never got deeper. The intimacy that felt conditional. The way you felt lonelier with him than without him. That wasn't your heart expanding. It was your heart surviving. It was you trying to grow roots in cement. And the truth is, it's not your fault you called that void love. When you've been starved for emotional safety, even the smallest gestures feel like a feast. When you've been trained to accept crumbs, silence can look like calm, and indifference can feel like peace. But now you know better. Now you see it clearly. That wasn't love. That was emotional emptiness dressed up in vague hope and pretty lies. You didn't fall in love. You fell into a void. But the good news, you don't live there anymore. You've climbed out. You've looked that emptiness in the eye and said, no more. You've chosen your voice, your healing, your truth. And that void, it will never be your home again. Because now you know, love doesn't feel like being lost. Love feels like being found. You were loyal to confusion, not love. That's the brutal truth that hurts the most when it finally hits you. Because you weren't staying for the warmth, the consistency, or the safety. You were staying for the what-ifs, the unanswered questions, the hope that maybe tomorrow he'd finally explain, finally show up, finally choose you the way you kept choosing him. But he never did. And yet you stayed. You stayed because confusion had become your comfort zone. Not because it felt good, but because it felt familiar. You kept telling yourself, if he didn't care, why would he still be here? But he wasn't really there. He was physically present, but emotionally unreachable. You were in love with the potential of who he could be, not the reality of who he was. And so you created stories in your head to make sense of the chaos. You gave meaning to mixed signals. You justified the silence. You rationalized the distance. Because the thought that he just didn't love you, or worse, didn't care enough to try, was too painful to sit with. So instead of walking away, you stayed loyal, not to him, but to the version of him you hoped would one day exist. You fell in love with fragments, with flashes of affection that came just often enough to keep your hope alive. With those rare moments when he'd look at you like you mattered, only to go cold again the next day. You called it complicated, hard to read, emotionally guarded. But the truth is, you were clinging to confusion because clarity would have forced you to let go. And clarity is terrifying when you've invested your soul into someone who never asked you to. Because if you admit he's not the one, then what was it all for? What were the tears for, the compromises, the sleepless nights and journal pages filled with apologies you never received? That's why confusion became your drug. It numbed the truth. It gave you just enough false hope to stay, even when your soul was screaming to leave. You kept telling yourself, he's just not good at communication. He's been through a lot and needs time. And while empathy is beautiful, it should never cost you your peace. You were giving him permission to remain unclear, to remain distant, because your loyalty to understanding him outweighed your loyalty to protecting yourself. You showed up over and over again to try to fix what he never even acknowledged was broken. He didn't need time. He needed accountability. He didn't need more space. He needed to step up. But you kept waiting, not because you were weak, but because you were loyal to a fantasy. You were loyal to a story in your head where he would eventually see your worth, apologize for the hurt, and become the partner you always knew he could be. But some people don't change. Some people stay exactly who they are, and they let you break yourself in half trying to make the relationship work while they remain untouched. He gave you confusion, and you gave him commitment. He gave you distance, and you gave him devotion. And that imbalance, that quiet, slow emotional starvation, it doesn't feel like abuse at first. It feels like a challenge, like a puzzle to solve, like something you can fix if you just love better, try harder, stay longer. But love should never feel like a riddle. You shouldn't have to decode someone's silence just to feel seen. And what hurts most is that while you were losing sleep trying to make sense of him, he was sleeping just fine. While you were tearing yourself apart trying to be enough, he never even noticed the pieces falling. And that's the moment you start to wake up. When you realize that confusion isn't romantic, it isn't deep, it isn't mysterious, it's emotional neglect in disguise. Loyalty is only noble when it's mutual, when it's built on trust, communication, and emotional presence. But when it's built on confusion, on mixed signals, on the hope that maybe next time will be different, it becomes a prison, a cycle, a slow bleed that leaves you questioning your worth every single day. You deserve love that's clear, love that shows up, love that doesn't make you beg for answers or wonder where you stand. You deserve someone who says what they mean, who follows through, who makes you feel secure, not dizzy. You deserve the kind of love that doesn't just make sense in your heart, but also in your mind. But in order to receive that, you have to stop being loyal to confusion. You have to stop calling the H in your chest passion. Stop calling inconsistency mystery. Stop calling pain patience. That wasn't love. That was chaos. That was a storm you stood in for far too long, hoping the rain would eventually stop, not realizing you were standing alone the entire time. You were loyal to confusion. But now, you owe loyalty to your clarity, to your healing, to your truth. And when you finally choose that, everything changes. Because the moment you stop choosing confusion is the moment you make space for a love that doesn't make you question if it's real. It just is.